Welcome to this RackForm Explainer. Today we're going to be taking a look at one of my favorite features simply because it saves us so much time for doing a really common operation, and that is the SQL Automator for populating all pages. So what this basically means is if you have a job where you need to collect some information and then go back to that form and be able to pull out the exact same information that was submitted to the database so you can resubmit it, this feature is for you. There's two main modes for this. There's the more complex version, which we'll take a look at here shortly, which is populating where we have buckets in our job. That is elements that repeat. And there's the more simplified form, which we'll take a look at first, which is just I have a form, I have a couple fields, and I have a submission page, and I want to, again, submit records and then pull those out and update them. So in the common workflow, it would look something like this. I'd have my various fields in my form. So let's say, in this case, name and email. And then I want to write these to my database. So it's important to note that because I already have an existing database we'll be writing to, in this case, a table called FB demo, I do want to make sure that my field names right here match the column names in my database. So I have FB demo, so I have name and email. Notice it's lowercase n and lowercase e, and so therefore my field names are lowercase n and lowercase e right here. So it's kind of making sure that capitalization is really important to this. Now the labels can be anything we want. So for example, I can maybe make these capitals again so it looks a little bit nicer, but we do want to make sure that the field name is going to match in the database. Now when I do this, I would typically go in and I'd use the SQL plus Automator here to select my database type, provide a database name, in this case FB demo, and then I would click SQL plus insert item right here to go ahead and have RackForms create the item that will write this entry to my database. And notice here that it's added this SQL plus item and it's now inserting in FB demo to the name and email fields, and the values that it's writing are the form field, this F token for name and email. And when we actually run this, then I can put in I'm just guessing there, but we'll say she's 99, close to it. But here we have a record then, and you'll notice then that actually here, let's change this and be a little bit more respectful. We'll say 95. I know she's up there though. So now we have this record that we wrote to the database. So what now happens if I want to pull this record out and write back to it? So traditionally, I would do something along the lines of this. I would first go in and I would create a copy of my job, and I would rename my job something like update. So whatever this was, like insert user underscore update. And I do that because I want the separation of duties to be very strong here. I don't want a version of my job that both writes new records and updates them because that would be usually a security issue. So I would create a brand new job for the updating operation. Then what I would do is I would go in and I would manually add a query item to my form, and the query item would select from whatever table I want, and I would pass to it essentially an ID parameter, or whatever our primary key for the table is, to say, grab me the record where the ID is equal to 313. So whatever a unique identifier is, grab that record. Then I would go in, and because I have a query that's running and returning a result, I would pre-populate my default values for my fields that I want to have values for. And then on my submission page, I would add a second query item, and this item then would perform an update based on the ID that I've given it. So I can do all of this manually, and it's not too hard in the simplest cases, but again, we like to save time, and that's what the populate option does. So taking this as our example right here, I'm going to right click, I'll go back into SQL plus Automator, and this time I'm going to once again supply my table name. Very important that I have this right, and again, very important that my field names match. So again, lowercase n, lowercase e here to match my two columns. But this time, instead of clicking SQL plus insert item, I'm going to click on populate all pages. And what this is going to do is all the things I just sort of described, but automatically. So I'll click this. It's going to make sure that our table FB demo exists, or to make sure that we already have it. And if it does, I'll just click OK, and then we get this. So what has actually happened? Well, the first thing it did is it created this code block at the top of my page, and it is now going to go in and it's going to ask me if I've provided an ID via a get variable called ID. And if it does, I'm going to unset a session variable that contains that value. When I now have a session variable called ID, I'm then going to perform my select statement, in this case selecting all from fbdemo, where that ID is equal to the values I'm passing in here, either from a session or a get variable. There is a security note here, which is that generally speaking, you want the ID that you're going to be pulling in to be coming from a secure context. So either you want to have your form behind a login, or you want to make sure that if somebody has access to this form, that they're only able to pass in the IDs that you want. And it's a little bit, I don't want necessarily outside a scope of this particular video because logins are a whole different thing, but it is really important to note that in many cases, what you actually want to do is instead of using the GID right here, you just use the session variable. And if we do that, we actually then remove the second OR right here and the second G, so that we're only selecting based on the session ID. You see, a user, as we'll see in a second, can create any get variable that they want. So in theory, they could pull any, in this case, user they want, but they do not have the ability to change a session ID. And so typically a session ID, you would be setting programmatically, right? You would actually be based on some other thing earlier in the form. You would be saying session ID equals something, and then that session ID is what you'd be using to perform the select statement and then indeed the update later on. In this case, and again, to keep things simple, we don't actually do that. We're just saying go ahead and use either a session ID or a get ID that you passed in. When we do that, then we perform our select, we populate our two form fields, and then on the submission side, we're going to simply run an update statement to update the fields as I've been given. And then finally, we'll unset the session ID that was passed in, so that if you come into this form again with a different ID, you will then pull that user. So what it looks like in course then is basically this. So here I have my form. I have an ID value that I'll put in. So I'm going to say ID is equal to 302. It's now pulling this record. However, you'll notice if I pass in 303, it's going to pull a different user. So here now it's going in and it's pulling the record based on what ID you've passed it in. And again, that ID value is matching right here. And then when I click submit, it's now going to update that record as it's been given. Now, you'll notice that my fields were pre-populated. That's because before this video, I was sort of preparing the form. You'll notice now, if I go back a page here, this field is going to be empty as long as I haven't given it a value. So in other words, let's go ahead and submit this one more time. Let me just paste in a raw URL here. You'll notice these two fields are empty. And that's not by mistake. That's because we haven't given it an ID value. So again, I have to give it some valid ID value. And when I do that, that's what tells the system to go in and to pull up a record. So now you'll notice it's pre-populating those fields. So very kind of important that we understand why that's happening. And then critically, if I get rid of this query string, it's going to keep pulling our value right here. Actually, here, let me do this. So you'll notice there's no query string, but it's still pulling that value. And that's happening because when I pass in a get right here, it's going to unset any save session value that I have. So it'll overwrite it if I pass in a different one. So if I say ID equals 303, it will happily, pull a different user. And that's very common, right? Like I've said, I want to change this user, so I'll go ahead and visit this record, but that's not the user I want. I'm going to go back one page and select a different user. We need to make sure we can always select a different user, but it's very important that at that point, this session value is now set to whatever that get value is. That's what this bit of code does right here after a query. We're essentially going in and saying, this is now the active user, and we do that because we need to make sure that if you reload your page right here, that we don't clear out all these form fields. That would be very bad. So we save that session variable, and it's only going to get cleared now when we hit the submission page of this form where we unset that session ID. That is why when I hit submit right here, if I go back to that previous page, it's empty because that session variable that was once saved and it was causing that query to pull its record, it's now been cleared. So I know it may be a little bit overkill for some of our users out there, but it's hopefully really important that even if you don't have the technical background, they kind of understand why that's all happening. So that's basically it though. Again, if we go back to our form here, you can see that it's handling all these various items for us. Now there are a few limitations here. We don't use, or we don't support file uploads with this system. It's mainly going to be your standard, form input fields like a textual base. But for the large majority of cases, especially when we have file management, this should be a really powerful feature. Now there's one other thing I want to talk about in this, which is a very handy feature, which this also works for bucket items. So let's go ahead and take a look at this from scratch. So I'll go ahead and delete my 2 pages here, and I'm just going to add a form page and a submission page, so very simple. And on my form page, I'll have a single text field and then maybe a bucket where I then add to it 2 text fields. So let's say here's my first text field, here's my second one. Add a submit button. And then for this guy, I'll just say, let's say name and email, keep to our simple fields here. And then for this guy, we'll say, I don't know, team name. So this is like a common form where I have, let's say, a team, and then I have the players on the team. And this guy then is going to be a bucket repeater. So I'll go under bucket repeater logic enabled, and I'll say enabled. And when I run this form now, I should get a little something like this. I put in a team name, and when I click plus, I'll get more records that I can add. So in the typical workflow for this then, I might use my SQL Automator to create, let's say, team data. So I'll create a table called team data, and I want this to then create the table and SQL plus insert item. So I'll click this, and it's actually going to do 2 tables for us now, which is really nice. So it has created my main parent table, and into the parent table, it's going to go into team data, the team name field, which is what we want. But then it's created a child table, which is our bucket data. And this then is a bucket, you'll notice here, called bucket 2. And you'll see here that it's going to write into a table called team data, so the name of the job. It's a bucket, and the bucket is called bucket 2. And it has a foreign key and then the 2 fields within there, so name and email. And so let's just take a look at what this does. So I'll go ahead and run this. I'll say this is the Packers, and I'll say Brett Favre and df@packers.com. And I'll add another one, and I'll just create some fake name. And I'll go ahead and submit this. I go to my submission page, and now if I look at my database, I should see that I have my team data. So here's Packers. You'll notice its ID is 1, and then team data bucket has unique IDs for each record, but then you'll notice the team foreign key is 1, because that's what the team ID is. And then I have my 2 records, so Brett Favre, Stan Smith, and their emails. So this then would be like the first version of this job. So this, for example, would be team entry. So maybe I just save this, and so here's a job called team entry. Then when I want to go through and create the update version of this form, I would actually delete the insert items from my form, and I would name this, again, as we talked about before, I would say like team entry update. Then what I would do is, without changing anything else in the form, I'm just going to go ahead and right click, and I'm going to say for SQL Automator, go ahead and look for the table called team entry. So you'll notice here that RackForms wants to help us by saying, well, your table name may be the same as your job name, so I'm going to put in table name update. But that's unfortunately not the case here, because what we're actually wanting to do is write back to that same table called team entry, or team data. Actually, yes, team data, not even team entry. We want to go to that same table called team data with our data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, same as before, I'm going to click Populate All Pages. And this is going to do even more this time. It's going to do the same basic test that we saw before, where it's going to put in the logic where we can kind of capture the record that we want. But now it's also going to handle that bucket repeater for us too, which is really nice. So I'll click this, and now it's added a bunch of code in here. So let's just kind of take a quick look at what it's done. So it's added 2 code blocks. The first item right here is doing the same thing that we saw before, where it's looking for a get variable called ID. And if it has one, it's going to kind of reset it for us. That way we can kind of hit new items. It has also done the same thing for our bucket items right here. We don't need to understand any of this code. Just know that this code is usually what we'd have to run in order for this whole logic to work. It is now, it's then also creating a population a query for our standard form field here, so our team name. And then it's also created a select item for our bucket. Now, it is really important here that I move this guy up to the top right here. And you'll probably see this change throughout versions of RackForms, but really these items should always run before everything else on the page does. And so the code that runs here again is all the code that that helps us update the bucket, and we just want to make sure it's above the bucket itself right here. So I'm just gonna, by convention, just move all these guys on top of the item right here, or on top of all the form items. Then finally, it's added a couple items to our submission page. So the first is it's going to update the team data, so just our team name. Then it's going to delete all the items from the bucket using our given ID. And then finally, it's going to re-enter all those items in the bucket. So this kind of uses like that strong form of just take whatever we have, delete it, and then we'll re-enter it so that we have the fresh version. And so if we run our form, we should get a little something like this. You'll notice now that it's empty by default. But if we go in and pass it that first ID, so ID 1, ID equals 1, it's going to pre-populate my form. Notice it's grabbed those two bucket items, and I can go in and I can add a new item, and we'll add a new player, for example. And when I click submit, it's going to effectively delete all those items that were in the bucket. And you notice we didn't change the name here, so that stayed the same, but now we have our new player here. And so this sort of workflow is automating all the processes. And again, you saw there's quite a bit of code in order to get buckets to work like this, but it's automating all that for us. It is important to note that if you ever wanted to change this, then this is pretty much the last thing we should ever do in the job, simply because it needs to make sure that all the field names are right, and it sort of adds a lot of code to our job. And so it's really important to make sure that this is the last thing you do. If, however, you ever wanted to, I guess you would say, undo what this has done, you could do that. Just simply delete all of the items that RackForms made during that creation process. Delete all the field population fields, like so. And then this has now reset the job back to normal, right? There's nothing about that sort of population process that is hidden from you. It's just literally all a bunch of code blocks and SQL items. In other words, it's using the basic features of RackForms to perform that logic. We have just simply deleted all that, so the form is just like any other form now. It's just a bucket that happens to have a field in there. And if we run this, all of that logic that we had before is gone, and that's exactly what we'd want. So that then is our sort of tour of this feature. Again, in the most basic scenario, things where we don't have bucket repeaters, it should be pretty darn simple. You just make sure that you have your field names the same as what your database tables are. You have your table name match any table that's already in the existing database, and then you just click the populate all pages. RackForms will create all that data for you. In the more complex cases, things where we have bucket repeaters, we'll want to make sure that, again, our table name matches. So team data, I'll do this. We just kind of make sure that we shouldn't have to change any of these, especially if we do the copy the job and rename it. All these field names should be the same. And we just click populate all pages. And we just want to make extra attention, or pay extra attention, that if we have any of these data items that RackForms added, that we make sure we add them so they all come before the form fields. So in other words, this database item right here, if I had it below this wouldn't actually populate those query items. Again, we try to get that mostly right, but it is important to note that just by convention, I would just take everything that RackForms created in that step and just move it to the very first thing in your form. You want to make sure that this layout is the same. So 2 code blocks, the main sort of non-bucket item population, and then the one that says bucket field population, make sure that comes afterwards. And just make sure they're above all the other form fields, and you shouldn't have any issues. Though if you do, as I always like to say, please contact us. Always happy to help. So that is our demo. Questions, thoughts, comments, as always, please let us know, and happy form building.